this is my first kind of public debut talking about this book I've been working on for about a year and a half now. So yeah, this is kind of a test run to see if it has legs, so to speak. So thank you, Kevin, for inviting me here to talk about it. So I'm going to sort of fill in some of the background about why my family went to Slovakia, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the business of writing a memoir, and I will end with some excerpts which hopefully will excite your interest and guarantee sales, many sales for years to come. Right. So as Kevin mentioned, I come from a Slovak-American family on my father's side. That part of being Slovak was always very important to me as a child. My mother's side is German and Danish, Prussian, kind of that whole Northern European mixture up there. Probably because her ancestors came just that much earlier, 19th century, to North America. It had somehow been lost more. We sort of knew we were from there, but very few like Christmas cookies left or traditions like that anymore. It wasn't such a big deal. That side of the family had sort of more eagerly assimilated into the great general American thing. Plus, we all know there was that issue of a couple of world wars early in the 20th century that made being German a little less sexy. However, we all know Slovak is very sexy, if people can distinguish us from Czechs, which is an ongoing effort. On my dad's side, the ancestors started coming largely in the early 20th century, so the connection was closer. My dad knew his grandparents quite well, and they were the ones who immigrated. He would describe for me one time the thick accent with which his grandfather spoke English. And so there was just a much more present sense of that being who we were. They lived in ghettos, so to speak, or intensely Slovak communities in Connecticut. On my grandmother's side, it was in Illinois, Streator, Illinois. Some of you may have connections there. And so they lived also in a very intensely church world. My grandfather was a pastor, and when he went to seminary, he got a dispensation not to study Hebrew, the Old Testament language, so he could work on perfecting his Slovak, which he only knew by ear, as a child. Growing up with it, he never really learned to read and write it properly. So he did that so that he could then go and serve Slovak American communities. That was starting in the late 40s up until his retirement in the 80s. So for that kind of second half of the 20th century chunk, there still really were enough living Slovak American Lutheran congregations to need pastors who could still preach in Slovak and do the liturgy in Slovak. So my dad and his brothers grew up hearing the Slovak spoken, but they weren't taught it. By the time they were born in the 50s, their parents no longer spoke it to each other at home. In fact, my grandmother, terribly enough, she had to memorize the entire small catechism by Martin Luther in Slovak, but she didn't even understand Slovak, so it was kind of a wasted experience in that respect. So she and my grandfather spoke English to each other, and their children didn't grow up with Slovak at all, just sort of in the background. So anyway, as I was growing up, by then I was third generation born in America, so there was a sense of being very proud of who we are. We still had more of the traditions, like the poppy seed roll cake, that was a big thing. We had friends, other friends, non-relatives in the Slovak American communities that we were close to, so it kind of kept going. But, it wasn't, we're pretty American by that point in time. So it probably would have just gone on that way, except this little episode in November 1989 took place when all of a sudden, apparently overnight, communism collapsed. And the whole Soviet bloc just kind of dissolved, and suddenly borders were open, and people could travel, and ideas could travel, and you could have a free press for the first time. And so I'm sure all of you remember this well. For those of us with connections in the former Czechoslovakia, this was a really thrilling time to suddenly have access once more. My great-grandfather did manage to visit Czechoslovakia once during the communist period in 1967. That was a great year to visit. 2 years later, we're no longer a good time to visit because of the crackdown after the Prague Spring. So there had been almost no opportunity to reconnect with the old country. My dad and his parents managed to go in the summer of 1989, so just a few months before communism ended. And they still remember well the guards with the machine guns and the long scrutinizing of your passport and all these kind of things. no idea that it was going to end so soon. Actually, nobody there had any idea it would end so soon either. So all of that is sort of the build-up to the fact that when finally the Soviet Empire crumbled and it seemed that democracy was going to become an option for these countries, and most importantly, there would no longer be persecution of people with religious faith, which was pretty bad throughout the region. The seminary, the Lutheran seminary, and I'm sure the Catholic one too, though I don't know as well the Catholic story, were just flooded with students, because finally you could go and study to be a pastor. You could become a pastor and not be persecuted. Your family would not be punished. Your brothers and sisters would not be denied good jobs or enrollment in another university faculty because you were being publicly religious. So suddenly the student population of the seminary quintupled in a couple of years' time. Well, this is a great problem to have, but it was in fact a problem because it was so badly understaffed. One of the communist strategies in the second half, from the Prague Spring to '89, was not so much the overt persecution of putting people in prison, though that did still happen, but what they called normalization. And what this was more a matter of trying to encourage people to collaborate on a very low scale level. The idea was that it would just demoralize everyone enough, and everybody would be tarnished enough that no one would be able to speak up, because you could easily be exposed for a fraud or a collaborator or something. And so the persecution became very soft. Another expression of this was simply preventing the pastors who did go through the system and became pastors to get PhDs, so they wouldn't be able to become professors. Or the people who did become professors weren't allowed to travel. They weren't allowed to get books from other countries to read. Slovak, very tiny language, not a huge indigenous literature and theology or anything else. So it was really just trying to slowly squeeze them to death. Not like, if you execute people, you create martyrs. But if you just slowly squeeze, compromise, that seemed to be the better strategy for the second half of Czechoslovakia's communist period. Anyway, when communism did end, you had very few professors, very few with many Western contacts, not been able to keep up in their fields, were utterly exhausted from just fighting for so long. Most of them were also congregational pastors too, many of them bitter, angry. They've been through a whole lot. And now you have these cheerful young people flooding in, no persecution, no oppression, no nothing. It's so easy for them. So some generational misunderstandings that make our American 1960s look mild by comparison. So my father was asked by another Slovak American friend, you're got a PhD in theology, you've always said you wanted to teach. How about going back to the mother country and seeing if you can help out? So my dad said to my mom, what would you think about moving to Slovakia? And my mom said, how soon can we go? And that was that. So about 2 years after the idea was raised, we moved in August of 1993. I was just finishing high school. In fact, I graduated a year early so that I could accommodate the move. So I spent what would have been my senior year of high school in Slovakia. It was summer 93 to summer 94. And my first visit to Slovakia actually was 6 days after its division from the Czech part. So I missed Czechoslovakia by 6 days. So close shave there. My dad brought me along for a visit before we moved. They thought since I was 16 going on 17, pretty big move, I should at least have the chance to see the place first. And I loved it at first glance. I just thought it was so exciting. We lived in this little town in upstate New York. The idea of going to a little town in Slovakia was so much better. So I was pretty thrilled by that. So we moved there in 93. My parents ended up staying for 6 years. So did my brother, who's much younger than me. He was 9 when we moved there. I went to college the following year, but I came back every year at Christmas and for long summer breaks. Just really loved it. Has always been very dear to my heart. And in 1999, my parents moved back to the U.S., but we have had ongoing connections there, visited there. Is that me? Weird feedback loop going on there. Okay, never mind. So, that is the basic story of how my family got there, and how we landed there, just interestingly, right at this crucial year of Slovakia's first independence. Now, I should say, a little history footnote for those of you history buffs. there's a question that really Slovakia's first independence in 1993. So, should acknowledge there's a period, 1939 to 1945, where Slovakia could be considered independent, but I'm sure you all can feel what those dates overlap with. The so-called Slovak independence was really being a puppet state of Nazi Germany. It was forced on them, sort of exploiting their desire for a little more autonomy from the Czechs in order for the German Nazis to be able to take over the Sudetenlands, which was easier to do once they split up the state. And the head of state, Josef Tiso, was a little too eager to collaborate, not like he really had much choice anyway. And as soon as the war ended, Czech and Slovak were put back together. So as far as I'm concerned, that doesn't really count as Slovak independence. I'm going to give credit to the 1993 one. And of course, that's a much nicer story for Slovakia too than the one that starts with the Nazis. So that's the story of how we got there. Now I want to talk just a little bit about what it was like in that particular year. So I don't know if how many of you visited Slovakia recently? A couple years ago, right? So now Slovakia has like high-speed highways and shopping malls and every kind of Western product and fast food you could possibly imagine. It's beautiful, polished, shiny, at least in Bratislava, well accommodated to Western tourism. There's the internet, the phone lines actually work. It's very much like any other European countries right now. In 1993, it was not like that. Kevin mentioned I'm moving to Tokyo this summer. In a way, Tokyo in 2018 is much closer than Slovakia was in 1993, even though the plane ride is obviously a lot longer. There was no internet in Slovakia then. There was no email back then. Email started kind of to become a widespread thing in 1994, the second year my family lived there, and I went to college. Thank God, email became a thing and we could communicate every day. But for that first year we lived there, we wrote letters. We wrote them out by hand, or we typed them and printed them on this thing called an inkjet. Very exciting. There was a phone. We had a 5-digit phone number. I thought that was really funny. 5 whole digits could cover the entire nation. But the cost of calling another country was just prohibitive. So we had 5 minutes with each set of grandparents once a month, and that was it. So there was a sense in which we were really like going like missionaries in the days of old, totally cut off from the past. There's no way we were going to visit in less than a year's time. So the whole time my parents lived there, they came back in the summer, and that was it. No other visits back home. There also was a lot less variety to eat than there is now. So we got to experience wonderful Slovak cooking firsthand, but all we got to experience was Slovak cooking firsthand. There was not really any other option. I remember there was a Chinese restaurant, so-called, in Bratislava, but its main dish seemed to be stir-fried cabbage and kielbasa. So, I mean, kind of, sort of, not really. There was no fast food there. I think towards the end of our first year, Little Caesars came in. That was very exciting. Not that we'd ever gotten Little Caesars before, but we were willing to take anything. I remember in December of that year, we took a visit to Germany, and there was a McDonald's, and we like practically fell on our knees and worshipped. I mean, now I don't think McDonald's is anything special, but at the time, wow, that was so special. There was no tuna fish. There was no mayonnaise. There was no peanut butter. Oh my gosh, that was hard. So kind of all these standard things were simply not there. On the other hand, there were things like mushrooms that people went and picked out of the woods themselves and then thought you would just eat. Like, I don't know about you, but as I grew up as an American, like, I was just taught every single mushroom that you find outside is evil and will kill you instantly. You never eat wild mushrooms. And they would, like, with my brother in 4th grade, he just went off into the hills one day with all the kids to pick mushrooms, and each kid was sent home with a bag full of wild mushrooms to eat. And I remember my mother just staring at this bag like, these were so frightening looking, but surely they wouldn't send poisonous mushrooms home with children. just great example of culture shock, that kind of disbelief over what you see in front of you. Another example of this was chestnuts. Again, something you read about in a Charles Dickens novel, right? But not an American thing particularly. So in October, there were lots of gave us a bag, and they said, oh, by the way, you should cut an X into them before you bake them. And we thought, oh, that's like Brussels sprouts, right? They always say you should put an X in a Brussels sprout, but it makes no difference. We're not going to do that. It's too much work. So we shoved them in the oven. Well, turns out chestnuts are like popcorn. They will explode if you do not create a release. So all of a sudden, our oven starts going boom, 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 as all the chestnuts exploded. And my mom, of course, turned off the oven right away, but they kept going. And we were afraid to open it. We didn't know if they'd come flying in our face. So we managed to entirely destroy our first batch of chestnuts. And this is just what it's like to move to another country. It's not the big stuff. Like, you know that at Christmas we'll have different traditions, or they have separate national holidays, or they have their traditional dress. Isn't that cute? But those are like, they're not really culture shock because you're expecting them. It's more like culture anticipation. Culture shock is when you think you know how to be a human being, and then you find out you're wrong because you don't hold your knife and fork in the right hands, or you don't know how to get the cover on the duvet without fighting it, and then you see someone else just go, oh, you put it on inside out, and then it's done. Oh, right, okay. Seeing milk sitting in a cardboard box at room temperature, thinking, can that be? Is that okay to drink? Yes, actually, it's fine. Slovaks don't drink spoiled milk all the time. The milk in the cardboard box is, specially preserved to stay that way. Things like going to the grocery store, getting a huge supply of groceries, and then finding out they don't provide bags. And we didn't have bags along. How are you supposed to get your groceries home with no bags? So it was things like this, always kind of catching us off guard. Funny to look back at now, but at the time, what do you do with a huge, more than you can carry in your arms to get your groceries home? It's pretty frustrating. So those were kind of just like any everyday, ordinary cultural things. But of course, we moved there also in 1993. So this is only 4 years after communism ended. It's, on Slovakia borders with a former Soviet republic. I was about 13, I think, when the wall fell in Berlin and started off this whole chain of events. So I didn't have a huge, lifelong Cold War consciousness, but I grew up in the 80s. I remember Ronald Reagan talking about the evil empire. I heard about the Bay of Pigs and social studies, and, you knew Russia was bad, USSR was bad, whatever. So suddenly, it's over. Is it over? Are we sure it's over? Yugoslavia is exploding down to the south of us, just on the other side of Hungary, and just that Russia's just so big, and it's just really close by. So there was always this kind of slight unease, wow, we're on the other side of the old Iron Curtain. And of course, even in 4 years, it's just not enough time for people to totally adapt. So if you think about American democracy, we had a long practice, immigrants who came here, of just looking after themselves before there even was such a thing as a national government. And they'd had a couple hundred years of political philosophers thinking about democracy and what that had to do with the market and how you structure elections and constitutions and checks and balances. You can't just switch that on overnight. And the attempts to do so don't usually go very well. So people were already 4 years in kind of cynical about what they thought was democracy. It often happens after a huge change. You've been waiting so long for the bad thing to pass away. But the dawn is not as golden, let's say, as you thought it would be. So I remember we had one relative out in the center part of Slovakia near Martin. And I remember he would talk about Zlatý komunismus, golden communism, the good old days when everyone had a job. Unemployment was really high in Slovakia at the time, and would keep getting higher. Of course, your job might be handing 2 squares of toilet paper to somebody in the train station, when they came in to use the bathroom. Not a great job, but at least you had a job, right? And, the roles were oppressive, but at least you knew what they were. There's a kind of Wild West, Wild East quality to these post-communist countries. And so that was kind of always in the air. And all of the kind of market supply problems have by no means been solved. So, for example, you've probably seen this too, or seen the pictures. Why did all the middle-aged women have this horrible bright red auburn hair dye? Everyone you saw had it. It was the same color, and it was awful. And we're just Slovak women must not have any taste, right? Well, that was a very Western capitalist inference to make. The true answer is because that's the only kind that was manufactured. When you have a centralized economy, you don't have any way of responding to market demand. In fact, we think market demand is bad. So somebody, probably a guy, says, okay, this will be the color that every woman will dye her hair. She doesn't like her natural gray. So you're gray or you're this hideous red. What's your choice? That was an easy choice in the end because it was the only choice you had. So just these kind of things. Or another one was all the women would wear these see-through blouses, which seems, oddly risque. But I think they just didn't know how to manufacture better cloth. And underneath them, they had these military strength brassieres, so it's not like you were seeing anything. But that was just what everybody wore. One time my mom found in the store this little can that was labeled horse mackerel, product of the USSR, not in Slovak or Russian, in English, German, and French it said this. And then it said, empty contents as soon as opened, which is a very ambiguous sort of instruction. You didn't really know would it self-destruct if you didn't, was there eavesdropping device inside? Who knows what was involved. And so we tried it, and it was awful. And we asked, again, ourselves the obvious American question, why do they sell the stuff that nobody wants? Wrong question. Again, in a communist economy, somebody designates what you will produce, and what you produce is what you get. And the reason it was on the shelf was because nobody wanted it. It was going to be a last resort. And so it was only us fool Americans who hadn't already learned that horse mackerel was edible that bought it, thinking that it was there because people liked it. No, it was there on the shelf still because nobody liked it, but somebody high up had to create it. Another thing we noticed was that as buildings started to be refurbished, they were painted these insanely bright colors, like lavender and lilac, or bright yellow and seafoam green, and all these really tacky bright colors, like the whole exterior. And again, you're like, Slovaks have no taste. Again, still hadn't learned the lesson there. Now, in this case, it wasn't a matter of what paint colors were available. In this case, it was because finally you were allowed to do something different. One of the key things about communism is the communal part, which is the ideal part, is also matched by extreme conformism. And so there was a strong social bias against doing anything to distinguish yourself from anybody else. So we were even told you were discouraged from putting out the flower box. Because why are you trying to look nicer than your neighbor? Are you criticizing all your non-flower box neighbors? Are you trying to look more special? Do you have more money? You're trying to show off? So there's this kind of flattening effect that happens. And the sort of ubiquitous gray of those horrible high-rise buildings, but even of the smaller concrete block or, solid concrete homes, whatever, there's always this pressure, just be plain, just be like everyone else. If you stick out, you will be noticed, and it will almost certainly go bad for you in the end. So now that it's okay to be different, they just were really different. And if they wanted to paint their house bright lilac purple, who is going to stop them? So there was a sense in which even the color of the houses was an expression of freedom, even more than it was an expression of maybe aesthetic preference. Okay, that I think gives you some sense generally of what we were coming into, why it was so interesting and so strange in so many ways. So I've always really enjoyed thinking back about this time, talking to my parents and brother, keeping in touch with friends, the miracle of Facebook and all that. But I never really thought about doing anything particular with the experience. So yeah, it was just there. It was part of my life, and I realized it kind of probably started me on my lifelong journeying around the world. I moved to St. Paul from France 2 years ago and lived there for 8 years. So yeah, quite the world traveler. It was while I was living in France. I lived in Strasbourg on the eastern edge, right next to Germany. That I met up with an American woman who'd become a good friend. Her name is Macy Halford. And she was in the process of writing a memoir, and she worked at the New Yorker, so she was super cool and very well connected, and she had a contract from NOP, so I was kind of a little starstruck by her. Anyway, she grew up in she grew up in Dallas, definitely not rural, in Texas, And so she ended up writing a memoir about growing up with this devotional book called My Utmost Toward His Highest. Maybe some of you have heard of it. I think it's more of a southern thing than a northern thing. Anyway, it's sort of her own story of growing up in this particular kind of Baptist religious culture and this devotional that meant a lot to her, but her mismatch with a lot of aspects of her own church culture, and then discovering France. She was married to a French guy, French first too, of course. Anyway, so it was just kind of this, I thought, really beautiful exploration of, cultural differences, religious differences, and I just thought it was really cool. She was writing a memoir, and so I remember one day thinking, if I were to write a memoir of my life, what would I write about? And seriously, the thought had never occurred to me. I wasn't really a memoir reader or anything. It was just an idle question that came about from having a friend who wrote a memoir. And I thought, well, thank God, most of my life has been boring, because, an interesting life is, a good thing to read, but not necessarily a good thing to experience. And then I started thinking about this year in Slovakia. I know, now that I'm 40, middle-aged, can look back on my youth, that was really the turning point in my life. I think for a lot of people nowadays, going to college, leaving home, that's kind of the turning point. But for me, it actually came the year before college. It was this experience of moving to another country and just how radically different it was, how it connected me to the old country, the family, but also kind of started me on this life of travel, and kind of how I thought of myself ever since then. Had a lot to do with my faith development, all these kind of things. And then I also recalled that I greatly enjoyed in Slovakia something that I had totally lacked during high school, which was attention from the other sex. And it's great to be an American 4 years after communism in a little village in Eastern Europe. Let me just tell you. So that was a lot of fun. And I thought, well, that'd be a funny story to write about too. So I just started playing with this idea, mentioned it to my parents. They said, oh, that's a good idea. And then my mom said, wait a minute. I think we have all the letters that we wrote to your grandparents. So she goes digging in their files and discovers, thank God, it was the year before email, because the letters all exist on paper. 1 year later, everything is gone. We have almost no documentary evidence from mid-1994 onwards. But for this 1 year, 93 to 94 before email, we have all these letters that my sainted and now departed grandmother saved and kept all in one place. So she gave them to me, and I started reading through them, and I was thrilled because great detail, but also I couldn't believe how much I'd forgotten. And not just of everyday stuff like trips that we went on, or visitors that we had, or various other things. It was a kind of shocking, like, wow, memory is a weird thing. Like, in most cases when I read them, I remember them, but I have to say there were a few things I read, nothing there. It was like, it's got to be deep in the brain somewhere, but even reading, a direct account of the time can't unearth it from wherever it got buried down in my brain. So at that point, I started kind of looking into, guides to writing memoirs, or memoirs by people who have written memoirs about writing memoirs, that kind of thing, just to try to get a sense of, what's involved. You might just stop and reflect for a minute. If you decided to write about, say, your mother, or your siblings, or your friends, you suddenly start hitting up against, oh, am I allowed to talk about them in public, or what would that be like, or am I allowed to take other people's lives and put them on display? Because obviously, even a memoir about your own life involves lots of other people who touch you. So I read this one particular book. I can't remember what it's called anymore, but by some well-known memoirist. I never actually read her memoir. I just read her book about writing memoirs. And she was really addressing people who write trauma memoirs, which mine is not. But people have gone through especially terrible childhood abuse, or are refugees, survivors of some kind. And she said, you need to know one thing going into this, which is that your memory has played tricks on you. And this is really hard, especially if you're a survivor of something terrible, because often it's only your memory you have to hold against the people who hurt you, who will deny it. But she said, even when you know something or many bad things happen, still, if you start investigating the details, it's not going to be like you thought, and you have to be prepared for that. So I remember reading that thinking, oh, well, I'm not writing a trauma memoir, so this doesn't apply to me. Well, manipulable by yourself in later events, or you recast the past in light of things that happen later. So actually putting yourself back and trying to move forward through time instead of interpreting past things from what happened later is a really hard thing to do. So I got my first taste of this in reading the letters to my grandparents and all the things I'd forgotten or misremembered, not really anything of great consequence. Well then, I thought, there's one other set of letters that I should really find if I'm going to write this book. And those were letters I wrote to my high school friend, Colleen. We had actually not been that close before I left, but she was the one who kept writing back when I wrote to all my friends back home. And in time, we were writing these massively long, at least we had computers then, even if we didn't have email, so I could type instead of handwrite. But these incredibly long, detailed, I cannot believe how much time I put into recording entire conversations and analysis and trying to figure out this cultural habit or whatever. And it was just, massively long letters. And I remembered that I had written them to her, and I wondered if she still had them. Now you might say, why did you wonder? Why did you ask? Well, we had this little falling out that lasted 11 years, mostly my fault. And about 10 years ago, through, again, miracle of Facebook, we reconnected and made up, and I'm grateful to God as that being one of the best things that's ever happened in my life. But, she lived in New Orleans, we hadn't seen each other in person even in I think by then it had been about 7 years since we've been back in touch with each other, and so we weren't, living near each other, we weren't close again like we used to be. So then I emailed her every so often, hey, do you think you still have those letters? She's like, well, they'd be at my parents' house in upstate New York, I haven't been there for a while, blah, blah, blah. An opportunity finally came for me to visit her in New York, and while I was there, I said, do you think we could look in the attic maybe? So she said, all right, I can't make any promises, but we'll try. And lo and behold, stuffed away in the attic was the entire collection, all the letters I had written to her, 28 in all, 27, 28 letters in all. With the original stamps, the first couple ones still had Czechoslovakia stamps. I guess Slovakia didn't get its act together and issue its own stamps till about November of 1993, and everything that I had written her. So, took them with me, flew back on the plane to go home, read the whole thing in about 36 hours, and I was shocked and horrified to discover that I had always thought this one particular boy had been stringing me along. I discovered in reading the letters, I was the one stringing him along. I was the villain. All these years, I had remembered, we are on good terms, still in touch now, but I had always remembered, the way you do. And then I read these letters, and it just completely flipped upside down. Everything I thought I remembered about what had happened that year, and I was really horrified. I was such a twit, and I was so unfair to him. Oh my gosh. So this now became a matter of setting the record straight and offering an apology as well to him and a few other boys who got caught up in the drama as well. So being a pastor's daughter is not very advantageous for your romantic career in high school, plus classes, races, straight A's, terrible combination. In Slovakia, I sounded stupid all the time. It probably helped because, Slovak was a second language. So anyway, this was the one great year of romantic popularity, and it obviously went to my head. So there was a little bit of shock, wow, how many was I was not just stringing along him. I was stringing along 3, 4, 5 at a time. Terrible, I know, shocking. I am happily married now, not to a Slovak guy, 15 years, so all's well that ends well. But, you don't know that when you're 17. So, anyway, I read this whole roller coaster of adolescent emotion, and I thought, well, this is the real story. I do want to help Americans distinguish between Czechs and Slovaks finally. I'd like them to know something about Slovak culture and history, so the memoir will also have some instructional sections, hopefully lively and interesting, like the best of history. But I had to be honest with myself, the really funny story, the really compelling story here is this romantic roller coaster of a 17-year-old who has no idea what's going on because she can't talk and she can't understand, and the cultural habits are different, and no one knows how to explain what's going on. I was getting dowry jokes within 2 months. So, like, what are you supposed to do with that? So a lot of the story is just this whole struggle towards understanding, which anyone who has successfully been in a friendship or a marriage or a relationship time for a long time knows that's what makes it work, being able to talk to each other. And so there's, I think, a really nice parallel there between figuring out how to make a relationship work and the literal figuring out how to talk, literally in the language. So that brings me now to, so that's the general story about the memoir and how I got there. And now I'm going to pause if you have any questions, and after that I will read some excerpts from the working draft.
Where in Slovakia did you live?
Oh, good question. So we lived in Svetiur, St. George, which is the first town outside of Bratislava when you're heading kind of northeast towards Petina.
So you weren't taking any classes when you were there, were you?
No. Well, okay, so I finished high school, and my dad, who didn't want my brain to go to waste, dads, enrolled me at the seminary, but all the classes were taught in Slovak. I didn't actually enroll in a Slovak language course. I just kind of, we had really primitive grammars, and I just kind of picked it up by ear as we went along. Plus, my classes almost never met, so that almost immediately got scuppered as a way to keep me out of trouble. However, there is still to this day in Bratislava a Lutheran high school that offers instruction in English. It's a bilingual school. And we actually had a cousin who was teaching, an American cousin who was teaching there. They had a library. I would go there to borrow books in English because there were no English books to buy in Bratislava at the time. And while I was there, the woman who was working as a volunteer librarian told me she had to leave in February because she left her husband and 4 teenage children home. And could I take over for her after she left? So I said, sure, I'd love to. So I ended up getting a kind of volunteer job to keep me officially busy during that year. But I didn't have any sort of formal language instruction. But when you're immersed in it, it goes a lot faster.
Was your brother in 4th grade? Was he in an immersion situation?
He was, yes. He had definitely a harder experience than I did. If you were writing the memoir, it would be a very different kind of story. So at the time, we didn't really know kind of how linguistic and neurological things went together, and I think they thought he could just go in and immediately just pick it up, but 9 is already a little too old to do that. Plus, because he couldn't speak and explain himself, he was immediately the object of great interest, but then he wasn't because he couldn't say anything, and everyone knew he was American, so he ended up getting bullied quite a lot as, local resentments against, the great empire that survived sort of expressed themselves against him. So he had a pretty rough start there. He did end up acquiring a decent amount of Slovak, but after 3 years, my parents moved into Bratislava to be closer to my dad's students, but also so that Will could go to English language schools there.
Did you go to seminary in the U.S. here?
I did, actually. So the next year, I had no intention whatsoever of becoming a pastor or studying theology or anything. Looking back now, it seems totally inevitable. But it wasn't until I got to college that fall and had a great theology teacher, and I realized, oh man, me too? 3rd generation? So after college, I went to seminary.
And you're with the church in St. Paul now?
No, not at the moment. I'm actually going to be a pastor of a Lutheran church in Tokyo.
Okay.
So, but I've actually worked in a congregation about 10 years because I'm also a theological scholar, so I've been working in that field instead. But I did serve a Slovak Zion Synod congregation in Trenton, New Jersey before we moved to France. So my first pastoral experience was also with Slovak group. They were not filled with adorable young men, filled with like the youth group were all in about their 70s. Very different experience. Yes?
I'm surprised that the seminaries filled up so quickly with young people intending to go into ministry.
Yeah.
When for so many years religion has been squashed. How was religious life being managed through the communist era?
Yeah, well, a lot of people who I think were devout just strategically opted not to go into seminary because they knew the fallout would be too bad. But probably the biggest difference is just that Slovakia has always been a much more religious group of people than, say, Czechs are by comparison. I've heard many people say that Czechs lost their faith when Jan Hus was burned at the stake in 1415. That's a
long time ago. So communism was almost in a way kind of finishing off a job that had already been nearly done by the time they got there. But the Slovak side was always much worried about it, had a very strong Catholic church. They were a huge part of the resistance movement that actually led to the downfall of communism. You always hear kind of about the demonstrations in Prague, but you don't hear much about what the religious movement was doing in Slovakia. But that was really important too. The Lutheran Church has always been much smaller, well, like since the 1670s, when they were kind of the end of the Catholic Lutheran struggle and persecution. The Lutheran Church in Slovakia was probably only about, at the time, 300,000 or so, but they had always been sort of the intellectual elite of Slovakia, so they had kind of a very strong, like if you were Lutheran in Slovakia, you knew why, and it was important to you, and it really mattered. And so I think when freedom came, that was able to find expression as well. And I would imagine it was much the same for the Catholics, because they had always been very openly resisting against the communist era. So I think that also, it was an easy transition back after communism ended. All right, well, let me read a couple of stories here to you. All right, this one is about my first visits in January of 1993. On my first visit to Slovakia, 6 days after its independence, I took my first proper train trip with my dad out to our ancestral village of Turani. There were white lace curtains on the windows. There was rolling countryside with whole villages of red tile roofs and not a suburb in sight. There was a dining car with a menu and waiters and real silverware, though the Slovaks seemed to prefer their own homemade picnics, untucking salami sandwiches on thick bread and hard-boiled eggs from their satchels. We took advantage of the vacancy to order Riesling fried pork cutlet, little knowing what awaited us on the other end. The train pulled into Vrutki, where we got picked up by car and driven to our village. My dad had been to Czechoslovakia twice before and done the rounds of all the third cousins once removed, but I was fresh blood and primed for initiation. So many relatives, all looking vaguely familiar, collided into me in waves of hugs, body smell, consonants, food, and slivovica. Ancient Milka, my great-grandfather's youngest half-sister, and her daughter, Marka, doesn't she look just like Annan? And Jan, Marka's son, and Jan, Marka's son-in-law. Nadia, Marka's daughter, married to the latter Jan, their children, Peter and Martinka, the other Jan's daughters, Martinka and Simonka, Irenka, Marka's sister, buxom, gold-toothed, owner of the local Potravini, which boasted one aisle for booze and chocolate, and one aisle for everything else, and her daughter, Yanka, and her daughter, Yanka, Tetka Betka, Aunt Betty, my grandfather's pen pal throughout the communist years, and her kids, and their kids, and nobody cared if I remembered their name, and it hardly mattered what my name was. Those who tried to learn it were thoroughly confused by my dad's introduction because Sarah sounds like the Slovak word for daughter, Sera. That was very confusing. The principal thing, our arrival signal, was the outbreak of an unholy war for the right, privilege, and status of feeding the Americans. Oh, I was hungry. I had long been stifling a latent hunger for the whole wide world, equally eager for Hong Kong and Helsinki, for London and Lhasa. Now I was finally feeding it, the feeding inflaming rather than satiating the hunger. And that voracity for the world extended to actual foodstuffs, mysterious recombinations of familiar elements in startling ways. But a limitless hunger for the whole of human experience is not actually matched by limitless physical appetite. Or at least I was no match for aggressive Slovak hospitality. The day after Dad and I arrived, we were compelled to consume five fried pork and fried potato dinners in one day. Not to mention the cake. At 10, noon, 3, 5, and 7. Eat up, Dad ordered me in a desperate whisper at the fourth stop of the day. I'm sure they've gone to great expense to give us so much meat. This is an honor for them, and they're showing honor to us. By hiding in the kitchen, I pleaded in equal desperation. Apart from their our smattering of German, we had no shared language yet, so half the time our hosts opted to leave us to eat in isolation. And I could imagine only too well the scene that would otherwise unfold at the Potra meeting the next day. The Americans don't seem to like fried pork very much. Really? They gobbled mine right up. Maybe they just don't like yours. A stupefied resignation overcame me as I dug into the fifth and final iteration at some now forgotten distant cousin's house, which was a handy buffer against the icky proposition from the drunkard father of the family when his wife was looking the other way. Likewise, pork cutlet coma dimmed any wonder I may have felt at the museum-worthy collection of mounted animal trophy heads at another home we visited the next day, where we managed to go only after extensive wrangling with Marka, who, for reasons that never became clear, held that particular relative in contempt. And we ate fried pork there, too. When the trip wound down, Jan and Jan drove us back to the station in Vrutki. Snow, slush, and freezing rain flew by on all sides of the jittery Škoda. Not that the inclement weather in any way inhibited the driving technique of our estimable cousins or of any other Slovak on the road. It is a distinguishing quality of foreign drivers that they are always worse than one's own. And of course, there were no seatbelts. Bracing ourselves, wondering to each other in English if this would be the end, Dad and I at the same moment detected Slivovica, homemade plum hooch, and enough of it to perfume the entire car. Drinking this early in the day and in this weather, Dad was horrified. Jan and Jan let out joyous shouts of "Nazdravia!" Dad was preparing a respectful scolding when gestures explained what words could not. Slivovica was not a drink in the driver's hand, but the windshield wiper fluid. Cheaper than the real stuff, they managed to explain in broken German, and it was just good. That did not mean, however, that booze for breakfast was out of the question. In the quarter hour that remained before the train departed, the two Jans plunked down in front of Dad a half-liter of beer and relentlessly watched him drink it all down. He was already enslaved to the dictates of Slovak hospitality. I got up easy with a handful of grated cheese. Okay, let's see. I've got time for a couple more here. Jumping ahead now. This is from now when we moved in August later that year, the morning after our arrival. We're now in Svetiur in our little village, and we went to live in the apartment, the pastor's apartment attached to the church. The pastor of the church lived in his own home in another part of town, so we were able to move in there. Jet lagged, I slept in late that morning. By the time I was up, puzzling over how to shower without a shower curtain around the tub, and in place of a shower head, a floppy tube that coiled and leapt like an angry snake if I turned the water on without holding the tube firmly in place, Dad was already off with Julius to try to open a bank account, and Will was playing with little Peter. The vigorous noon bells galvanized Mom into action. She and I would brave the Potravini, the tiny grocery store embedded in a family house, and find some food. Except, the Potravini closed at noon and didn't reopen till 3. Shopkeepers need to eat lunch too, you know. We came back home and stood in the barren kitchen at a loss. One expected to face possible famine as a missionary in Ethiopia, say, but not in Europe, for heaven's sake. Even if it was Eastern Europe, we didn't have so much as a packet of airplane pretzels. Then the doorbell rang. Anna, Julius's wife, had anticipated just such an eventuality. She sent over lunch in a basket, a pot of potato, carrot, celery, kohlrabi soup with a swirl of eggs beaten in. I dropped the soup, I thought, amazed. A plate of palatsinki, wafer-thin pancakes filled with apricot or raspberry jam and dusted with cinnamon sugar, and a bottle of mineral waters. Her proud couriers were Will, her sons Peter and Yulo, and another young man who beamed at us between his dimples, Yusho. That's when I knew it was going to be all right in Switzerland. The next morning, I was coming down with a welcome to street and a new set of germs, kind of cold. I got dragged off to furniture stores to behold the horrible Jetson-style designs, to quote my mother, on the upholstery. I sneezed and dripped and endured till the day was done, and well dosed with cough medicine, I could crawl back on top of my bed. It was at the precise moment when my contacts were out, but my teeth were not yet brushed, that Dad knocked on the bathroom door and said, "Misho's outside. He wants to visit. Your mother and I are having a nice conversation, so keep him downstairs." Frantically, I pulled myself together, scowled at my hair, and rushed down through the front courtyard where I confronted the mighty door. It took a good minute's struggle and finally, shamefully, my dad's help before I could wrench it open to let me show in. We spent 2 hours in the courtyard talking together in German. Two second language speakers regard the common tongue as a tool to be abused grammatically in pursuit of understanding, not eloquence. So we got to it, comparing our cultures, discussing the progress on the house, exchanging words in English and Slovak. He asked if I was cold. I was, but not about to admit it and end the evening any sooner than I had to. He asked if I'd like to go to the movies sometime, or swimming. When I could no longer sustain myself between the evening chill and the cough medicine, I let him out again a little more smoothly than I let him in and said, "Do widzenia," farewell in Slovak. He grinned at me. "Don't say that," he corrected. "It's only the formal you, we. You and I say tea to each other, so we say goodbye like ahoy or ciao." "Ciao," I said. "Ciao," he replied. In Slovak, anything can take the affectionate diminutive, even by. I never knew grammar could be so thrillingly romantic. As I was getting ready for bed, I heard outside my window, "Sara, Sara." I couldn't imagine why Misha would call at the window instead of knocking at the door. The muffled voice didn't sound like his anyway. I crept along the wall till I could peer out my corner window. A whole crowd of guys was clustered down there, smoking cigarettes. I didn't recognize any of them. One of them spotted me, and a whole chorus went up with, "Telephone, come outside." I slipped back out of sight. There was rakish laughter, and the boys moved on. Apparently, everyone in town knew that an American girl lived at the Lutheran church, and even knew her name. I was famous. I was exotic. A bookish girl who only just shed her glasses and braces. Yes, Satur was pretty all right. All right. This next one takes place the following month in September, when I had started going into Bratislava regularly to go to the classes at the seminary that I couldn't understand. Since my first visit the previous January, I had not seen a single person stamp a bus ticket. There was no electronic reader to scan, no barcodes, no pass flashed before the bus driver's eyes. People just got on and off. Every bus and tram was equipped with a punch box, changed routinely, and one stamped ticket was supposed to match the punch box of the day's pattern. I knew the theory, I just never saw it in practice. So I kept a sheaf of pristine bus tickets in my pocket and marveled at the public spirit, one of the few beneficial hangovers of socialism, or so I inferred. One day, as I was riding home through the dreary landscape of Racha, a kind of neither nor exurb of Bratislava on the way back towards Satur, two men in uniform mounted the bus. They hunched forward a bit, as if still molded to their desks, felted caps with the Slovak emblem sudclo on their brows. They held up badges for the passengers to see. Then, in perfect accord, all the Slovaks around me dropped a hand into pocket or purse and brought forth a corresponding badge. A glance was enough to satisfy the inspectors. The badges disappeared. The vacant stares at gray high-rises resumed. The collective secret instantly revealed itself to me. Commuters bought monthly or yearly passes, shown forth only at random request by the police. That's why no one ever punched a ticket, which meant that I, a foreigner, still not exactly credentialed with an adequate visa, was in violation, and completely without means of explaining myself. Inspector number 1 approached and muttered an imperative. I shrugged, helpless, blushing with guilt. He was surprised. Apparently illicit bus riding was rare. It seemed to be a treat. He barked a word to his colleague and the bus driver, and at the next stop, I was escorted off at the near edge of the no man's land where city transit ended. I wondered if they were going to take me downtown, whatever that might mean. Dad had mentioned that the visa office was in the former headquarters of the secret police. My insides were liquefying. Inspector number 2 spoke some German. Either a lucky guess or my half-German heritage showed up in my face. They didn't need to arrest me, as it turned out. All they needed was money. 700 crowns would do the trick. At just over $20, I thought the fine was a bargain price for my freedom. Luckier still, I had that much on me. More even. A 1,000-crown note in shades of blue with the Czech composer Smetana on one side and Prague's Castle Hill on the other, the currency still being held in common by the 9 months divorced nations. Just one problem. Americans may swan about the countryside with oodles of cash in hand, but ticket inspectors do not. They didn't have even 300 crowns on them, a mere $9, to make change. Wait right here, said Inspector number 2. I'll try to make change at the tabak over there. He left me in Inspector number 1's charge, who seemed antsy. He pulled out a cigarette. Didn't do well at high school German as his companion, I guessed, and his few awkward attempts at Slovak left me baffled. Anyway, I wasn't eager to get into a conversation. Inspector number 2 was gone forever. When he came back, he apologized. No one had changed. Neither the tabak nor the potravini, and here at the end of Racha there wasn't much else. To break the 1,000, they'd have to take me down to the station, after all. I had no idea if his explanation was for real or an attempt to extract a bribe from me. All I knew, as legions before me have known, was that a bribe was way better than a trip to the police station. Keep it! Keep the change! I stammered in panic German. Really? Are you sure? He replied in that fake polite manner of a pretend refusal of something you plan on keeping anyway. Yes, it's fine, I don't care. They smiled, waved, and headed off in search of a bus back in the direction of Bratislava. I was left on the curb for another hour, so distraught that I convinced myself that all the intercity buses had been canceled and I'd be stranded in horrible